Good morning and welcome back. Today I'm going to continue Galatians chapter 6 and from verse 4, and it reads, "But let each one examine his own work, and then he will have rejoicing in himself alone and not in another." You know, this is the big play word in here about where it says here, but let each one examine his own work. Yesterday I was speaking from verse 3, and we saw that it hints toward a little bit of narcissism that Apostle Paul's trying to explain here, which to me is a very, very dangerous attribute in life, and especially for someone wanting to function in ministry. But verse 4, it says, "But let each one examine his own work." You know, one of the things that I see that is, I think, really, really important is that to be content as to who we are and who God has called us to be, made us to be, and that we know that the work that God has called me to do may be totally different to what He called you to do. And I think one of the worst things that we can do in life as a person, as a minister or as a Christian, is to covet the things of others, and especially when we see that someone is succeeding in an area that we may be coveting ourselves, and so jealousy has the potential to sink in and do its work, and again we're reflecting back on the works of the flesh. And so the reality is that we need to be content being us, being you, and I need to be content being me. And it should come to the place that when we are walking in the Spirit, that when we see somebody else succeeding in their call, it should cause and create such great joy in our hearts. And in the same way that if we see a brother or a sister in Christ, or any person for that matter, that goes through difficulties, that doesn't seem to be succeeding at any given time, then it becomes a burden to us that would compel us to want to help them. But I tell you, when we looked in verse 3, speaking of the characteristics of that kind of person, when they compare themselves with and examine themselves against the work of others, if they seem to be seen as not doing as well as others, they go on a mission to try and destroy what you have. And I believe Apostle Paul has noticed this in the church in the region of Galatia, and this is why he said, let each one examine his own work. In other words, don't worry about what other people are doing. If they're excelling, let them excel and rejoice in that, but focus on what God's called you to do. Don't try and piggyback off any other person's revelation or the work that they're doing, and be content as to who you are. Do you know that you are the most qualified person in the whole world to be you? You make the best you and the worst somebody else. And I believe as Christians we need to be content as who we are and what God has called us to do. But if we find conflict inside of us that tends to want to covet after what other people have, or want to interfere or compare and pull them down to raise ourselves up, we know that there's a bit of a problem. And so when it says here, but let each one examine his own work, I think that this is a really good thing for us to do, to let us examine, let us have a close look at the way that we walk in the things of God, the ways we function, and to see the effectiveness of the ministry we have, the things we do, and learn from our mistakes and be encouraged by the successes. Because all of this, I believe we are to rejoice in Christ and rejoice in the call that God has called us into, and be very content in what God has called us to be and to do. So join me tomorrow, because I'm going to speak more along these lines. So God bless you, and I'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.